Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're plunging into a stack of sources you've gathered for us, all focused on English questions and, well, the fascinating ways people learn to master them.
Yeah, we've really dug into quite a range here. Articles on the core grammar, some research into common learning pitfalls, different teaching approaches, and even a really good look at practical techniques like role play for building confidence.
Exactly. So our mission today is basically to unpack all these sources, pull out the really essential insights, and give you a clearer understanding of not just how English questions work, but maybe why they can be tricky,
Yeah.
how to navigate common errors, and crucially, some effective ways to actually practice using them in real conversations.
Asking questions. I mean, it's the engine of conversation, isn't it? It's how we get information, connect with people, show we're interested. It's absolutely fundamental.
It really is. So think of this deep dive as maybe your shortcut to grabbing those key pieces of understanding from this whole stack of knowledge. Okay, let's really get into this. So let's start right at the core. What's the absolute, fundamental job of a question in English, and what are the main tools we use to signal one?
Okay, well, at the most basic level, you've got certain words that just signal, hey, this clause isn't a statement. It's looking for information.
Right.
These are the interrogative words, mostly the what words. Though one source rightly points out how is always part of that group, even though it doesn't start with why.
Yeah, the classic 5 W's and an H. That's a pretty handy mnemonic for learners, helps remember the main players.
Definitely. And each one has its specific job, although some are, well, surprisingly versatile.
Yeah.
You've got who, whom, and whose. They're squarely focused on identifying people.
Okay, so who for a person's identity. Easy enough. But the sources really seem to highlight what it as being, super flexible.
Oh, it truly is. I mean, while who is for identifying a person, what covers almost everything else? Things, actions, abstract ideas, whole situations.
Wow.
You can even use it for places sometimes. Like if you're asking about the identity of the place, what city is this? Or even a person's role, what is she, the team lead? But generally, you wouldn't use what just to ask who someone is,
Right, that distinction's helpful. And which? What's its specific role?
which narrows things down. You use which when you're asking someone to pick from a known kind of limited set, like which color do you prefer, red or blue? It implies the options are right there.
Ah, okay. So if it's an open field, ask what. If it's a choice from a menu, use which. Got it.
Precisely. Then you have where for place, location, and when for time or dates. Pretty straightforward, but obviously essential.
And why gets us the reason, the cause behind something.
Yep, looking for that explanation. And
Yep.
how. How is remarkably broad. It can be about the manner of doing something, the process, someone's condition, even asking for an evaluation like, how was the movie?
It's interesting the sources even mention those archaic forms, like whence and whither. You basically never hear them now.
No, you don't. But knowing they meant from where and to where kind of gives you a little glimpse into the language's history, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
And it also highlights that fundamental difference these words create between question types. You have these open-ended questions
Yeah.
using wow words, inviting all sorts of answers,
Right.
versus the closed-ended or yes-no questions. Those are looking for confirmation, maybe just a simple yes or no, and often use words like whether or if, especially in more complex sentences.
Okay, so we have the question words themselves. Now, let's get into the mechanics, the structure. This seems to be where English questions often become a major hurdle for learners because it flips things around compared to regular statements.
It really does. That standard pattern for the will questions is, well, surprisingly rigid most of the time.
Yeah.
It's WH word plus auxiliary verb plus subject plus main verb. That auxiliary verb is really the linchpin.
Like, what do you eat? Or where did they go? The auxiliary did, are, whatever it is, sits right there after the question word, but before the subject.
Exactly. And the sources give clear examples showing how the auxiliary changes with the tense. So, what do you like for present simple?
Okay.
Where did you go? For past simple, what are you doing? For present continuous, when will they arrive? For the future. That little auxiliary word is doing all the heavy lifting for tense and marking it as a question.
And for the simple yes-no questions, it's even starker, isn't it? You just stick the auxiliary verb right at the very beginning, before the subject and the main verb, like, were you talking? Or did you see it?
And this is actually where a really common challenge pops up. Say your statement is simple, like, you agree. There's no auxiliary verb like be or have already in there.
Right.
So you can't just say, are you agree? That's a classic error the sources highlight. English uses what they call the dummy auxiliary do in these spots.
Ah, yes. So do, does, or did has to jump in just to make the question structure work when there isn't another auxiliary. Do you agree?
Exactly. The sources really stress that forgetting to use do here or maybe incorrectly using be instead is a major, major pitfall for learners.
So that auxiliary seems pretty non-negotiable in standard
It
questions.
really is. Although it's worth noting, as the sources do, that sometimes in really informal speech, or maybe for the strong emphasis, you might hear the question word pop up somewhere else, like, you did what?
Yeah, like in disbelief.
Or you put it where? But that's definitely not standard question grammar for just asking for information.
Right, more like a reaction.
And standard question formation also has this strict rule.
Hmm,
Only an auxiliary verb or maybe a modal verb like can, could, will, would. Only those can come before the subject.
okay.
So you'd say, where was the painting bought? Using the auxiliary was.
Yeah.
You absolutely couldn't say, where was bought the painting? The main verb, bought, just can't make that jump before the subject.
Okay, so we've got the direct structures down, but what about situations where, you need to be a bit softer, a bit more formal or polite?
Right, that's where indirect questions come into play. The sources explain they're really essential for politeness, especially if you're asking about something potentially sensitive, like personal details, age, that kind of thing.
And they have this quite distinct three-part structure. It looks very different from a direct question. You start with a polite phrase.
Yeah, like, could you tell me? Or, would you mind? Then that's followed by the worry question word itself.
Or if it was originally a yes-no question.
Then you use if or whether.
Okay, and here's the really crucial bit, the part that apparently trips people up all the time. The final part is structured like a positive statement, not like another question.
Exactly. That's the key. So those polite phrases are things like, could you tell me? Would you mind telling me? Do you happen to know?
Huh? Loads of options.
So let's take a simple direct question. What time is it?
Right.
How does that transform? Okay, using the polite phrase, it becomes something like, could you tell me what time it is?
Notice that subtle but really critical shift in the word order at the end. Time it is. Subject it, then verb is. Just like a statement, not is it.
Yes. That statement structure being preserved in that final clause, that's the absolute hallmark of an indirect question. Let's try another. Direct, where is the station?
Becomes, could you tell me where the station is?
Perfect. And for a direct yes-no question, maybe something like, are you busy?
You'd use if or whether. So, would you mind telling me if you were busy?
Exactly. And again, look at the end. If you are busy, statement structure. The sources really hammer this home. The most common error with these indirect questions is accidentally applying the direct question structure, that inversion, to the final part.
So saying something like, could you tell me what is the time?
Right. It just sounds unnatural and, well, it's grammatically incorrect in that indirect format.
Interesting. So the takeaway is that politeness in English questions is often achieved by kind of embedding the question within a statement structure right after that initial polite opening. Speaking of things that trip people up, what are some of the other really common mistakes learners make when they're trying to form questions, based on what these sources found?
Yeah, the sources are pretty consistent on this. They point to a few key areas of difficulty again and again. Probably top of the list is incorrect word order.
Still forgetting that inversion.
Exactly. Learners often fail to do that necessary subject-auxiliary swap we talked about.
So instead of, what are you doing? They might say something like, what you are doing.
Precisely. They just keep the statement word order, and closely related to that is using the wrong auxiliary verb, or sometimes omitting it entirely.
Right.
This is where you see errors like where you live instead of where do you live, or that classic one we mentioned, are you agree instead of do you agree.
And presumably some of that might come from how their first language works. Maybe it doesn't need auxiliaries in the same way.
That's definitely a factor highlighted in some of the research. Your direct translation causing interference. Another common issue mentioned is omitting the subject.
Ah.
While English statements usually need a subject, it is raining, not just is raining, it seems even more rigid in questions. You always need that subject slotted in after the auxiliary.
Okay, makes sense.
And then there's just basic confusion between the WH words themselves. Confusing similar sounding WH words like where and when, especially early on.
I can see that. And you mentioned it earlier, but it seems worth repeating as a common mistake. Overusing what?
Yes. Because it is so versatile, learners sometimes try to stretch it to cover everything, even asking about a person's identity when they should be using who.
Like asking, what is your best friend? When they really mean, who is your best friend?
It's exactly that kind of thing. I think the main insight from the sources here is that these aren't just random errors. They often stem from a few core structural misunderstandings, particularly around that English question word order and the critical function of the auxiliary verbs. And really, consistent focused practice seems to be the only way to properly iron these habits out.
Practice is definitely key. And the best practice surely happens in real conversation, using the language for real reasons. So let's look at some of those, bread and butter questions you'll actually encounter and need to use in everyday English.
Yeah, the sources list a really great set of these, showing how these structures actually function socially, how we use them to navigate interactions and get basic information we need.
Okay, so the most fundamental one when meeting someone new, what's your name? Simple, direct, asks for identity. You also mentioned what can I call you as maybe a slightly softer alternative.
Exactly. And right after that often comes, where are you from?
Mm-hmm.
Asking about origin or location. Uses that nice where plus our auxiliary plus use subject structure.
Then, to learn a bit more about someone's life, what do you do? Is the standard, right? Asking about their job.
Yes. Or alternatives like, what do you do for a living? Or simply, where do you work?
Mm-hmm.
All using do as that crucial auxiliary for the present simple question.
And the absolute classic greeting, how are you? Or maybe how are you doing? How are you been? Asking about condition, status, using be or have as the auxiliary there.
Yep. And for practical needs, what time is it? Or the slightly more polite indirect form, maybe, do you have the time?
Right, and what are you doing or what are you up to? Just asking about current activity.
And importantly, if you sense something's not quite right, you need questions to gently probe what's wrong. Or is something wrong? What's the matter? Are you okay? These are all variations asking about a potential problem or distress.
Good ones to know. And finally, for small talk basically anywhere, what's the weather like? Or how's the weather? Just asking for a description.
What's really interesting, I think, is seeing how knowing these common questions and their typical answer patterns, I'm from A, I'm a goey. It's A, I'm feeling.
Yeah.
It creates a kind of conversational template.
Yeah, like a framework.
Exactly. A framework that makes starting and continuing interactions much, much smoother for everyone involved.
So, okay, you understand the rules, you know these common phrases,
Right.
but how do you actually bridge that gap? How do you get to the point where you can use them fluently without having to stop and consciously think about auxiliary verbs and word order every single time?
This is exactly where the sources really almost unanimously champion role play. It's consistently highlighted as just an incredibly effective and often quite fun speaking activity for language learners.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Because you're not just memorizing rules from a book, you're actually doing something with the language. You're pretending to be someone else, acting out a real-life situation, usually without a fixed script,
Right.
which forces you to use the language spontaneously.
Exactly. And that's the real power of it. It pushes you in a safe environment to practice both speaking and listening in contexts that feel genuinely real. You end up naturally using common expressions, you build vocabulary specific to that situation, and crucially, you build confidence. Because you're actively using the language to achieve something, even if it's pretend.
Confidence is probably half the battle, isn't it? If you're too scared of making a mistake, you might not ask the question at all. Roleplay seems to provide that safe space to try things out, maybe mess up, and learn from it without real-world pressure.
For sure. The typical process is pretty straightforward but effective. You get assigned roles, person A, person B, in a scenario. Maybe ordering food, asking for directions, discussing weekend plans.
Okay.
Then you act it out, focusing on asking and answering the kinds of questions that would naturally come up in that situation. Then you can switch roles, so everyone gets practice being both the asker and the responder. And importantly, you can get targeted feedback afterwards on your grammar, your pronunciation, in the context of that interaction.
And the sheer variety of scenarios available is really impressive. The sources mentioned examples covering pretty much everything, didn't they? Health habits, travel, work, hobbies, shopping, daily routines.
Oh, absolutely. Dozens of them. That huge breadth means you can practice asking relevant questions about almost any topic you're likely to encounter in real life. It reinforces all those structures and the vocabulary we've been discussing today, but in a really dynamic, memorable way. It's kind of where all the pieces, grammar, vocab, pronunciation, confidence really come together.
Yeah, okay. We have definitely covered a huge amount of ground in this deep dive into English questions.
We really have. We've gone from the foundational words that signal a question is coming, right through the specific structures for direct and those polite indirect forms. Looked at the common pitfalls learners often fall into, and, importantly, why they happen.
Yeah.
Seeing how these questions actually function in everyday conversation, and then landed on a really powerful tool like role play for bringing it all to life through active practice.
Hopefully this gives you, our listener, a really solid understanding and maybe some practical tools to improve your own ability to ask questions in English. Because fundamentally, asking good questions is just so vital for connecting with people, for gathering information, for navigating the world around you.
It's really fascinating when you lay it all out like this is seeing how seemingly small grammatical details, like just the position of an auxiliary verb, or choosing between a direct and an indirect form, how much weight they actually carry in terms of clarity, but also social nuance.
That's a great point. So, as you reflect on everything we've covered today, maybe consider this. Beyond just getting the grammar right, what role does your intention behind asking a question play in how you actually phrase it? How does thinking about who you're talking to and why you need the information influence the specific structure or the words you ultimately choose to use? Something to mull over.